Hello, everyone. We're just going to give people a minute to get into the webinar room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you're not distracted by the bells behind me. They will be done momentarily, but my name is Natalie Gallagher. I'm the president of Stravos Education. Very excited to welcome you here today. So this is a webinar that we are very pleased to be able to offer as the Stravos organization. So whether you come from ESM or Appleruth or UES or Summit or Launch, any of our education partners or brands, we are excited to welcome you here today and sit down with Mike and John to have what I hope will be a really helpful and meaningful conversation for those of you who are looking to start your career. Maybe you're early in your career and you're thinking about changing. They're just going to be incredibly helpful, and I'm very excited to welcome them today. So, who are our speakers? Mike Harlambakis and John Farrar have both been at Google for more than 10 years at this point. Mike is the director of international growth. John works on the education team, runs that team. Together, they have collectively hired hundreds of people, sat in on more interviews than most of us could even imagine. So they have seen it all. They're particularly passionate about helping younger professionals who are just getting started into their careers, just getting that first job, that first internship, or starting to sort of craft their career and figure out what do I want to build, right, during my time working. So just really excited to welcome them and their expertise here today. Thank you, John and Mike. I am going to turn it over to you all and let you talk from here. Before I do, just real quickly, a couple of housekeeping items. So John and Mike are going to tee us up with a little bit of just some information, background information. We're going to have a discussion, and then we will leave time at the end for question and answer. So we would absolutely recommend, if you've got questions as you're listening, go ahead, put them in the chat box. There's a Q&A chat box you can see. If you put those in, we will have time at the end. We'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. So please use that liberally. Thanks. All right, turning it over to you guys.
Wonderful, Natalie. Thank you for the opportunity to join on behalf of John and I'm Mike Harlambakis. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. We want to set the stage here around career preparation and really give you a foundation as to why this is such an emerging question and an emerging gap that unfortunately is not being solved as intentionally as it should be. So like any good argument and any good proof point, you have to ground ourselves in the data. And what we see here is really a staggering disconnect that 92% of educators are confident that their graduates are ready to enter the workforce versus 11% of that confidence shared by employers. And if that gives you pause, it should. It certainly gives us pause. And we want to unpack that a little bit for you. And I think what's going on here in our view is that there's a disconnect between education and employability. And employers tend to view universities and colleges really as the gatekeepers of workforce talent, yet those same institutions aren't prioritizing job skills and career readiness. And so the idea that having a degree from a well-regarded institution is sufficient enough to gain employment is really false. And let's understand that a little bit more clearly. Unfortunately, at the counselor level, the investments are not being made to a degree where students at the high school level as well as at the collegiate level are being guided and advised as to what their career options may look like, what type of curriculum they should pursue, how this translates into employability, and certainly the hard and soft skills that are required in order to enter the workforce. So just quickly looking at career readiness, if you're in a university or were that is providing this in many respects, you're more the exception than the norm. So skills like how to write an impactful resume, a cover letter, a meaningful LinkedIn profile, really just overall professionalism coaching, courses in critical thinking, a whole range of these services, unfortunately, are not being prioritized and emphasized right now. And we're seeing this translate when employers are hiring. And we're fortunate at Google to attract incredibly high caliber candidates from all over the world, and yet this gap still remains. And today's conversation is meant to equip you with some ideas and thoughts about how you can grow those skills, grow those muscles, and translate them when you're seeking employment, not only as you're coming out of university, but throughout your career. Natalie, next slide, please. I talked a moment ago about this blend of hard and soft skills. There's a really grounding data point here that almost 50% of employers believe that soft skills are the greatest need of their employer base. And so this notion that you know how to manage conflict, you know how to communicate effectively via email, you know how to manage up to your leadership, that you're empathetic, you're adaptable. All of these are equally important as the hard skills that you're gaining from your major and or your university. And John and I love to say that you choose an environment, you don't choose a job. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the environment is a very unique one right now. And with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Yeah, greetings, everybody. As Mike was talking through this, reminded me of a story. I'm fortunate enough to be on the Cal Poly Business School Advisory Council. Go Mustangs. My wife went there, her two sisters went there. I'm immersed in that school and get down there a couple times a year. And in this topic, we talk a lot about these soft skills that Mike's slide has up here, where, again, half of employers are espousing the ability to basically work in teams, be adaptable, be persuasive, etc., be empathetic. We talk about those in terms of soft skills as a definition. And it's interesting, the last conversation I had at Poly, we were talking about renaming those as success skills. And I think that's probably a better title. A lot of emphasis goes on STEM and real-time skills that are valued in these industries, but still the ability to work with other humans and build teams and communicate effectively is super, super valued. And that needs to come through when you're pursuing certain vocations, and especially in an interview setting. So let's talk about the landscape a little bit. Natalie, if you can move us forward. It's becoming a complex environment out there. A number of big layoffs to start the year. That's continued to trickle forward here. And we bring this up as the environment's getting a lot more competitive. I think I saw a stat the other day. The application rate of success at places like Goldman Sachs is 1.5%. I think Deloitte Consulting 3.5%. 0.5 at some other places like Facebook, et cetera. So you've got to be ready in figuring out how to stand out as the job market is getting more and more complex, especially in this window where we've seen some layoffs of skilled workers that are, in theory, competing for some of these same roles of early stage career. So the question then becomes all right, how do we stand out a little bit more? And I want to talk on sort of this emerging trend on the rise of certifications or short courses. Boot camps is another one you may hear about. And this is something in my role in education, working with big flagship universities, Ivy League universities, ed tech companies that are trying to support them. Where is this trend going? And Lord knows there's a lot of noise around this trend, but it is something that I think we should take note of. And that is the macro philosophy of always needing to upskill. I think that part is important. There are a number of different certs out there. Some are more valuable than others. Some cost money, some don't. I think the biggest point here is, and we'll probably dig into this in our conversation, is how do you continue to make yourself as relevant as possible, making sure that you've got the vernacular for the industry that you're channeling and the specifics on the company that you're interviewing with. So we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but it's a trend that I think certainly will never replace the degree, but I think we need to start thinking about it as supplemental for industry-specific pursuits. Okay, let's have a chat.
Great, thank you both. And thank you for just helping orient us into the sort of current landscape and some of the things that early stage career individuals, or frankly, any stage career individuals, may be wanting to be aware of as they think through options. I know a lot of I kind of want to start us off sort of big picture philosophical. A lot of the narrative around career that young people get is that you have to find your passion, right? Pursue your passion, do what you love. I'm curious what you make of that advice for today's learners.
Natalie, I can take that. Yeah. I think that narrative actually does graduates a disservice. I'm certainly not trying to puncture anyone's dreams or ambitions here, but I think what's more important than finding your passion is actually understanding what you're good at and how those skills and those muscles and qualities are going to translate into the workplace. If you can combine the two, meaning what you're passionate about and what you're good at, then you've really hit the lottery. And if you can translate that into a work outcome. But the point here is that the marketplace, employers, universities, that environment, you are valued based on what you've done or have the capacity to do. And so clearly understanding that and being able to articulate that to a prospective employer is more important than the passion piece. And so what's so critical in this is that self-awareness. Let's say approximately a 22-year-old coming out of university has likely had a pretty good sample size of feedback up to their point in life at that point around what they're good at. And so being able to understand that, tell a story around that, communicate that on your resume, communicate that in interviews, and demonstrate to people why they should make that investment in you is the vital piece in this. And that is anchored in, again, understanding what your strengths are and what you're good at. And so I don't want to seem as a contrarian. I'm very much an optimistic person who is very passionate about this space. But I do think that the right balance between passion and skills is really the sweet spot of how to approach this particular narrative.
Great. Thanks. Now, you were talking, Mike, about telling your story, right? A little bit, crafting a resume, kind of starting to tell that story. Your slides allude to the importance of real experience. Everybody has to start somewhere. What advice would you give to someone just starting out about how to craft an effective resume?
Yeah, it's a great question, a very tactical one too. There are best practices for this that we've seen throughout our career. First, just anchor you in something that I think is really, really compelling. On average, a hiring manager or recruiter spends 6 to 8 seconds looking at a resume to determine if the candidate is someone that they want to move forward to have a conversation with. 6 to 8 seconds. So in effect, your resume is like an advertisement that either is going to catch the eye or not. And so there needs to be a very practical understanding of how others on the other side of the table are going to view your product. The best resumes have 3 components: what you've done, the skills and qualities that you possess, and the impact that has resulted from your work and your experiences. The Achilles heel or the fatal flaw of resumes when looking at those 3 pillars is that overwhelmingly most resumes really only focus on what the person has done, meaning the duties. Like, I did reports, I'm an analyst. Okay, what did your work result in? More informed decision making for executives, saving the company money, introducing a whole new opportunity within the marketplace because you found a pattern or a trend that was identified through your work and you recommended it and the recommendation was adopted. My point here is that coming back to this self-awareness piece and understanding what you're good at, your resume is your product, is your brand, where you get to articulate what you've done, what it means for you, and what that's going to mean for your prospective employer, and the impact from that. And so that ultimately are really the three hallmarks of an effective resume. What I would also say is that the aesthetic matters tremendously. The format, how the picture looks, again, 6 to 8 seconds. So if it's attractive, someone's going to want to dig in. If it's multiple colors, if it is sloppy, if the bullets are too long, if they're written in passive voice versus active voice, I think these are the types of things that can dissuade someone from wanting to move forward with the candidate.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Just from a very tactical standpoint, what types of experiences are appropriate to put on a resume or maybe not, right? So if you were the leader of your high school sports team and that's one of your major experiences so far, is that something to put on a resume or something to leave off?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's likely an illustration of leadership, right? And how you've organized others and how you've built consensus, how you've managed disagreements. And so again, this comes back to looking at the experience, turning it around, and being able to say, what does this translate into as far as how would this be valued by a prospective employer? So if you're significantly removed from high school, you might want to reconsider that. But the notion that you've had these really meaningful leadership experiences throughout your life are the types of things that you would want to emphasize when you're telling your story.
Great. So not everything that goes on the resume needs to be a paid work experience in the traditional sense.
100%. That's right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Natalie, let me jump in there on that one. I think Mike's bringing up a good point on, let's just use your sports example. Like, I think you'll hear us say this probably a number of times today, but being a student of your craft is really important here. And what I mean by that is understanding the capacity, the industry, the company you're applying for. So as an example, I lead a sales team. People who are motivated by the scoreboard are people that tend to be successful in our line of work in sales, right? If you thrive on keeping track of progress, understanding, the training that's gone into it, the delivery with the customer, the outcome, that's probably a motivator that would be consistent with athletes. Not that it's necessarily, that all salespeople are athletes. That's not my point. But some of these qualitative aspects that as an applicant you can point to and say, like, look, I think I'd be a good fit in sales because historically I've been on teams. I like being motivated by the scoreboard, the standings, et cetera. So I tend to think it's a little bit less on exactly what you've done, but how you're positioning it for the roles that you're pursuing. And I feel like that's an area that can be sharpened by a lot of candidates just by thinking through exactly the capacity they're applying for and how to apply whatever it is they've done as a strength to that hiring manager.
That's really helpful, John. I think brings up a good point that people may or may not think about. So it sounds like you would not recommend having one resume to rule them all, but to really shape that resume based on the type of work that you're applying for. That if you were applying for a sales job on your team, that resume with the same experience might be written a little bit differently than if you were applying for, say, a service position. Is that right?
Yeah, I definitely think that you should be tweaking your resume basis the positions you're going for. And those tweaks should reflect what homework you've done on the space that you're applying to get into. Mike and I talk about this all the time. Authentic networking or authentic positioning, showing like, hey, before I got to this interview, I talked to X, Y, and Z people. I attended, A, B, and C seminar. I have been watching, these trends. I read up on these things. I follow these podcasts, whatever it is. There's a way to add those things to either a cover letter, a resume, or once you get in an interview, finesse that into the discourse so that somebody is saying, holy cow, this person not only wants a job, but specifically wants this job and thought about how their skills apply to what I need. And so, yeah, I don't think you need to overhaul the resume for every single job, but I think you should think twice about, okay, what are the keywords here, quote unquote, that might get the attention of somebody for this specific capacity I'm going after.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to move us forward a little bit off the resume and kind of back it up even farther and say, okay, but how do you even find the jobs or internship that you might want to apply for, right? The internet is vast. The world is vast. It's hard to know what to go after or where to look. Where would you recommend somebody start with that?
Yeah, a couple things. And maybe this is a question for also later that we'll hit on. Ellie, but I'm a firm believer in networking. And I say that as somebody who wasn't very good at it early in my career. Frankly, I don't think I developed it even as a competency until somewhere in my mid to late 30s, right? That said, there's nothing blocking anybody from being good at this, frankly, in high school, middle school for that matter. What I have found is that people want to help people. Frankly, when you're asked to do either networking or to mentor somebody, it's flattering. And I think there's probably some intrepidation that goes on around that. But I would tell you that that was one of the ways that I ended up getting an internship early on was, again, not conscious and I wasn't good at it, but just a little bit of networking with people that were in my immediate sphere. My first job ever was as a caddy back in Metro Detroit. And so happened to know a couple of people having carried their bags for years that helped me get into my first internship. So that's number one. Try to develop that skill around networking. Say yes to opportunities almost always. You never know where that tree is going to lead you and what awareness that will create for you in terms of careers and maybe industries you hadn't thought of. I was raised by two public school teachers. Their working knowledge of the corporate world was limited, but their advice was, go caddy. So I tried to meet people that way, tried to say yes in that regard. And the other tip I would tell people is try to show authentic interest. Again, how do you do homework on these people before you meet them? That shows like, hey, I can really be a value add here. And that's just hustle stuff. That really doesn't have much to do with degree or GPA or whatnot, but that's just, again, being a student of your craft, having some emotional intelligence on how you pursue specific individuals and how you can make that relationship last longer, authentically down the road. And then again, usually that's the way that some of these opportunities come to young people. Mike, I don't know if you've got further insight on that.
Yeah, I would I think really great points by John and completely agree. I would add one more, and it's also relationship management, which is really an offshoot of networking. When you're 20 years old and a junior in college, you're not necessarily thinking about what the person sitting next to you is going to be doing in 10 years or 20 years. But those people are going to be potentially vital to your career and ideas and opportunities. And so there is and it's not just within your immediate peer group, but also your professors or someone you may have worked for right when you were coming out of school. And the notion that you maintain the relationship, you continue to invest in the relationship, and you do that with a degree of intention, not because you're seeking immediacy or something right out of it or what you can get from that. It's not transactional, but it's to say that if you're staying top of mind, if you're sharing an article you saw that is a passion point of theirs, how do you continue to share those? And I think maybe we've moved away a little bit from that because these things now are done a little bit more at scale, right? So meaning you go and you post on LinkedIn for everybody to see, and that's a nice way to demonstrate thought leadership and sort of carry your message at scale, but it may not be as pointed to those one or two people who you might be better served to follow up with them individually. So I think there's a balance there, but I just really want to stress the relationship management piece of this as something that very, very important throughout your life.
Let me tell a quick story that brings Mike's point to life. When I interviewed for this job, I tried to get some outside perspective. I think at our company, we all do the homework on internal contacts and we know all those people. I think one thing that we can be better at just generally is talking to people externally that might have a perspective that we don't have, right? And so it just so turns out that my childhood second baseman on my little league team also was the VP of product at a company called Coursera, which enables higher ed courses across the world. He then went on to be the lead investor for a private equity firm at called BlackRock. So for EdTech in specifically, he was leading that practice. And so I ended up talking to him extensively about this role and kind of where he sees the space going. The point is, to Mike's point, relationship management, preserving contacts, creating authentic ways to stay in touch with people. You never know how they can come back around and help you at a particular career stage.
I love that. That's Thank you. I think good stories, good advice. I would say if there's any young person out there listening, absolutely, lean into what John and Mike have said about not being shy to ask. I myself spent an hour last night with 3 MBAs who had reached out because they were interested in a project that they thought I might be able to provide some good insight into. And you're right. People are very willing and excited to do those things. So make the ask. Don't be bold. Don't be afraid of that. I did, John, kind of going out of order from what I thought that we would talk about, but you brought up LinkedIn. So I want to circle back to it. Actually, Mike, I think you brought it up. But what advice you have for setting up a LinkedIn profile? Like, how do you set up a effective one? Are there any other platforms that you would advise that young professionals get onto and use?
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of LinkedIn, mostly because I think going back to my point earlier, I wasn't a good networker in the early stages of my career. Also, LinkedIn was not really a thing, right? I think it would have helped tremendously. And frankly, the example that I just gave helped me to back channel into my childhood second baseman, which then allowed me to understand what he was doing and then have that conversation. So I think it's a tremendous tool. I also think it's important that you flex everything professional in that tool, if that makes sense. So again, the places that you're trying to join, the industries that you're most interested in is important. And it does start with the foundation of the resume. So setting up, I think it's really important. Get that resume down, and then there are ways to translate that resume onto LinkedIn. And then further, I don't think you need to flood it with posts, but you should know that people oftentimes will look at your LinkedIn profile maybe before the resume. And so to the extent that you can flex through your posts or through the things that you've attended, you're interested in these different verticals or these different industries, companies, people may look at that LinkedIn profile, see what you've attended, see what you've read, see what you've posted as a way to say, yep, this person is a student of their craft. We should pursue this interview or not. So you never know who's watching there. And I would tell you, LinkedIn probably gets more traffic initially. I'm going through a series of interviews right now for a role that we have open in Los Angeles. I get the resume. I also checked LinkedIn profile at the same time, just to see if there's something incremental there. So it's definitely something that you want to have updated. It's a great networking tool. You want to make sure that it's in as good a shape as your resume. Your resume should be that foundation, setting that up though.
Yeah, just one more quick thing on that, Natalie, around sequencing. John was talking about this at the end. The resume is indeed the foundation. Cover letters sort of come second. If you had to put them in order, and then resume and LinkedIn is maybe 2B, or if the cover letter is 2A, LinkedIn is 2B. But the idea that in order to have a meaningful LinkedIn profile, you've likely had to done the work to build a meaningful resume, right? But once you've built the resume, it sort of informs all of the other products, and it's going to solve for probably 80 to 90% of what you need to do with your cover letter and your LinkedIn profile. So for folks out there who are listening to this and saying, hey, I'm just getting started, I'm going to go update my LinkedIn profile. If you don't have an updated resume, we would suggest starting there and then using that to build the next 2 products.
That's great. And I'm glad that you brought up cover letters, Mike, because I did want to circle back to them. I know as someone who we certainly don't do as much hiring as you all do, but we do quite a bit. And the vast majority of candidates, or if they're applying through something like Indeed or that, they don't bother to send the cover letter. They just hit a button and send their resume without any sort of bespoke communication. Are cover letters still important now? And if so, how would you advise that people go about writing effective ones?
John, you want to take us on that?
I'm happy to. Look, we're moving to different phases of whether those are considered or not. Here's what I would say is I would always have one at the ready, and I would probably send it. And the reason why is this. I think it's another opportunity to flex the discipline of pursuing a specific role. We were mentoring somebody this summer around this who was pursuing several consulting firms. And our suggestion was make sure you read up on which practices they're best at. There's usually always something in the news that points to some of the trends they're trying to address with customers and whatnot. And I believe the cover letter is a good way to feather that in. So if you're going to do one, make sure that it's not just, a mold that you're working from, but that you're nuancing it hopefully with the latest trends to again point to like, I am authentically interested in your company. I've thought about my skill set and how it might be deployed against this trend that I'm reading about, in the news that you're involved in. So I think you should always have them at the ready. I believe they're good to send, especially if you know who the hiring manager might be. So I think they're pretty easy to templatize. And then also, again, just as we were talking about before, changing out some specifics basis the job you're going after. Mike, you have further thoughts?
Yeah, just one quick additional on that. So it's really interesting that you brought up Indeed or ZipRecruiter or LinkedIn, right? The mechanics of an application have changed, right? There are now these third parties that ingest the applications and then distribute them out to recruiters. And it may be that all they're seeking is the resume. Fine. If that's the case, then you have to work with what's been defined there. However, if you get an affirmative, if you get a yes that they want to talk to you, you have an immediate opportunity to influence. And that may mean that you're not talking yet to the hiring manager, but you're talking to the recruiter, and you're probably doing that electronically over email. And so what you may have written or had planned to write, to John's point, to have the cover letter at the ready, you're just basically taking the content and repurposing it and putting into the email to the recruiter, which then would likely get distributed onto the hiring manager. So the opportunity to interview, or really the interview never ends. Once it's on, it really never ends in terms of you being able to control what's in your control to put yourself forward in the most meaningful way. And so if you've written the content that would normally go into a cover letter, it can and likely will be repurposed at any moment for you to be able to demonstrate why you're so uniquely qualified. So got to do the work. It'll help you in the process. It's going to help your conversations when you get into those rooms to have those interviews. And that email may be the difference in you getting the interview or not based on what you've written.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Mike. And I'm glad that you brought up email because it is a tool that can be used very effectively or to a candidate's detriment. So I know one of your passions is about helping people craft their stories and craft their stories specifically through written word. So what do you recommend? What makes for an effective business email communication? Any red flags, anything that people should absolutely not do that you've seen happen and you just kind of cringe and that candidate, that's the end of it for them?
You got me fired up, Natalie. I'm excited. We need 4 more hours to go into all of this, but I'm gonna read 3 anchoring points for the audience just to give them some context on this. So 30%, on average, 30% of a given workday is spent creating, organizing, reading, and responding to email. 30%. It's really probably closer to 50, right? A week's worth of the New York Times contains more information than a person was likely to counter in the 18th century. And the last point is every 24 months, if not sooner, the capacity of the microprocessor doubles. Take those 3 things. And what it tells you is that there's a deluge of information out there, and email is still the primary business tool by which all of this is communicated. I've yet to encounter an organization that will voluntarily tell you that they manage email really, really well, right? I think it's just quite doesn't exist. It's a muscle, right? Writing is a muscle. Good writing is rewriting. And like any muscle, you need to train at it. And in my case, I manage teams all over the world, time zones, etc. And the primary means by which we're communicating is by email. And the secondary is video conference. And so it's really less about email and it's more about leadership on paper. And every time you send an email in a work environment, you are branding yourself. So, for example, there are essentials, there are best practices around all of this, and I'm just going to go down the list a little bit. So, if you subject lines are headlines, right? So you want to capture the reader's attention. If your subject line just says an update, it could be an update about anything, but an update about this very specific thing. Generally 1 point per email, right? State the main point up front, make the ask up front, make the deadline clear up front, specify the response that you want, be professional, right? Unfortunately, universities are not teaching. These things are very loose, right? I mean, email can be a reason why you lose your job. If you put it in writing, you can't deny it. And that's not necessarily being taught at the university level, right? So active voice, short sentences, focused paragraphs, no, don't make assumptions, coloring, quotations, keep all those things out, right? It's a business tool. Know your audience, keep the message concise. And ultimately, there's an emotional piece to this too. You might send something when you're really hot, right? There's a reason the draft folder exists. Write it, sit on it, come back to it the next morning. If you still feel the same way and you're certain that you need to send it, then fine, send it. But there might be other ways to solve for that. And this is, John and I talk about this all the time. We see this, that people are coming into the workforce and they're not trained on this. And when they're being handed a laptop or a work issued computer or a phone, in essence, it can be a weapon, right? That if it's used wrong, it could seriously hurt your career. It's not being trained at the university level. So I can't stress the importance of this enough to all of our audience members to use email as a business tool, that it's a brand where you can really differentiate yourself. And also how you manage it day in and day out is going to have a profound impact on your career.
Let me bring an example here that I think shed some light on what Mike is espousing. For this job that I'm in now, as part of the application process, there were 6 questions that we were given as the initial filter. And the direction was, of those 6 questions, it had to be done basically what is known as front and back piece of paper, right? No more than 2 pages. That's all you could use for those 6 questions. And I remember going through this, my initial responses were 10 pages long. I had 10 pages, and my point, and I felt like, hey, it's an important job. I've got a lot to say, et cetera, et cetera. The point of the exercise was, can you be executive and persuasive in your summary? And I think what Mike is saying points to that. And it's an important skill to learn out of the gate. And I'm telling this story as one that happened maybe 15, almost 20 years after I had graduated college. It's still a value. Right. And there's still, I think leaders are still probing for that to make sure that we can get those things across. So over a period of a week, I cut that down from 10 to 5. I've got an English teacher mother that helped me cut it down even further. But the point on Mike is espousing here is good writing is rewriting. And I think in these environments, it's really important on a daily basis, as Mike is talking about with email, but writing in general. Can you get your ideas across concisely in a professional manner that gets people to adopt them and progress?
That's great. There's some, so good writing, just active voice, concise, follow directions. I think to your point, John, if they give you a limit, stick within the limit.
Yeah, stick within the limit.
And Mike, I love what you said about it can be a weapon. I know something that we tell people internally, not necessarily when they're going through a job interview process, but certainly when they're on the team, is, hey, if it's a difficult message, might not be an email message, right? Maybe that's a meeting. Maybe that's pick up the phone. Maybe that's get on Zoom, because tone can often be taken out of context in email.
That's right.
I think that's just good for people to be aware.
Yeah, when you think about the communication hierarchy, the first most desirable preference is face-to-face. Eyeball to eyeball, I can see your body language, I can study that, I can respond to that in the moment. Second would be, phone and or video conference. Last would be written. Right? Those things don't carry. I would also just offer 2 quick points too. At Google, when we evaluate our team members for promotion purposes, on my team, you have to do sort of a write-up that follows a handful of questions where you're articulating your impact for, in this case, the last 6 months. I won't read it if it's more than a page. So in effect, the person's immediately been disqualified. That might sound a little harsh, but you have to be able to package it in a way. Most executives will not read things that are more than a page, in some cases even half a page or a third of a page, or they'll just read the headline. So build the muscle, train against it. It will serve you for your career.
Great. Well, I've got 2 more things I want to ask you about, and then we are going to turn it to the audience Q&A. So if you all have been hanging with us and have questions, please throw them in there because we're going to get to them in a minute. I know one person at least has asked, will there be a recording of this? Absolutely. If you registered, we will send you the recording after the fact. So please don't feel like you need to be frantically taking notes or anything like that. And if you have to hop off early for some reason, then, you will get the recording. So I did want to dig in your initial slides, you talked about certifications and how, 57% of people, I think was the statistic, are pursuing these alternative certifications. And, I'm curious, how are employers looking at those? As a lot of young professionals, I've heard conversation with them. I've heard them having conversations among themselves about, well, like, for example, there's a tech boot camp. How's an employer going to view that? Is that something that's going to be a feather in my cap or not? And, is there wheat to separate from chaff here, or is one certification as good as the other? Kind of, how do you go about navigating that landscape?
Yeah, let me jump in here. The wheat and the chaff. There's definitely a separation here, right? If you hop on LinkedIn or anything else, there's a zillion certs, short courses, boot camps being offered. And so you do need to do your homework on which ones are going to be most valuable for the jobs, again, that you're pursuing. I think I mentioned this earlier. I think these are really important for building a muscle that is, I'm going to continually upskill myself throughout my career. And I think you might as well learn it earlier because I think it will come up later. Let me tell a couple of stories on this. So I'm from Detroit. When you're from Detroit, you're like 1 degree of separation from a hockey player, and that is the case for me as well. Ended up mentoring the goalie for Notre Dame. His name is Dylan. For a number of years, he then grad transferred to Michigan State. He's fortunate enough to be playing in Europe this year. But throughout getting to know him, we have been prepping for him to enter corporate America at some stage whenever his playing days are done. So one of the things we had him do was got his resume tightened up. We sent his resume to the new hire team at Google, or one form of that. And the recruiter immediately reached back out to me and said, "This is great. Dylan has his undergrad from Notre Dame, as an MBA from Michigan State. But what would be really good on top of that would be if he had X, Y, and Z cert from Google and one of our competitors," and they rattled those off. And I say that because the recruiter didn't really know what I was doing for a living, didn't realize that I was in education, working with higher ed institutions, and yet still kind of espoused some of these things to as a way to stand out through a job process. And I think the advice was around, like, again, in this case, Dylan was applying to work in digital media. These were certs that would help give him a vernacular in an interview, or some skills that would allow him to hit the learning curve even harder in terms of what is needed in day one in that job. So I do think, like, yes, certainly not. I am not one who believes that these certs are somehow replacing degrees, but I do believe that they can help, again, show that you're a student of your craft. I'll give you another story for somebody kind of mid-career. Another woman that I've been working with for a long, long time, kind of the reverse, undergrad from Michigan State, got her MBA from Notre Dame, was applying for her first people management role. Happened to know the hiring manager. She went through the process. During the process, I said, why don't you get certified by this lead competitor for this team that is they're always up against this competitor that we work against. So went and got that cert. The hiring manager came back to me. She said, I'm going to go with Stephanie. And you know what? She took an entire weekend to get herself certified in our chief competitor. And so I say all that because the degrees are important as foundation, but in real time, some of these certs, which can be done over a weekend, some of them are longer, some cost money, many of them are free. I think all of them are valued because they give you a different perspective, and again, a vernacular in an interview that can help you stand out and demonstrate, like, yep, I'm in it for this job, Mrs. Hiring Manager, Mr. Hiring Manager, and here's how I've gotten ready for the moment. So, like a lot of trends, you got to be aware of which part of them is most relevant to you. Do your homework on them. But it is something that is rising. It is something that many candidates are engaged in. And then it goes back to kind of networking. Can you find people in those fields that can point you to the right certifications that are relevant for the jobs you're going after? Right? What homework can you do on this topic as well? I think is really important.
Great. I think that's really helpful. So we've spent a lot of time focused on how do you get noticed, right? How do you get your resume plucked out of the pile or get your cover letter to get you the interview? We haven't spent as much time as if you get into the interview, what do you do? And I know between the two of you, you've interviewed hundreds of people. So what advice would you have on do's and don'ts around the interview process?
Sure, yeah, happy to get us started there. And John, please jump in.
Yep.
So let's go under the hood for a second. We're able to share the dimensions actually at Google of what we interview for, specific to Google, but it's meant to illustrate sort of to point to where you're taking the question, Natalie. There are 4 dimensions at Google. One is role-related knowledge. So how has your background, your experiences, and the knowledge that you have from your experiences going to translate into the job, right? The second is cognitive ability, general cognitive ability, which is simply, how do you think? How do you problem solve? How do you look at opportunities, unpack them, and pursue a course of action? Really, how you think. We want to understand how you think. The third is leadership. Leadership translates across all dimensions of one's experiences. Whether you've led people directly, it's not limited to that. To your point earlier about you're the captain of your team, or how you demonstrated leadership to make a recommendation that changed the course of a certain opportunity. And then the last is really your attitude and your character. So those are 4 to help people understand kind of how it's approached here. To the specifics of the question, I think that there are clearly best practices here, and I want to stress 3. The first is the candidate being able to clearly articulate their qualities and their skills in a very concise way and how those translate to the job. For example, when I interviewed to lead Google's international growth team, there were 3 things that I stressed: that I love to build teams from scratch, that I love to deliver growth anywhere I go, and that I build high thriving cultures within my team. And I had examples that I could illustrate across those 3 categories throughout my career. But it was really the rule of 3. Most humans generally can only consume up to 3 things at once. So what are sort of the 3 fundamental qualities that you are going to bring to the opportunity? The second piece is you have to have a clear point of view on the opportunity. So John was talking about being a student of your craft. You've studied it, you've looked at it, you proactively will say, this is what I'm going to do. There's not really a wrong answer. The interviewer is not going to ding you for saying that you want to pursue opportunity X when they're really thinking about opportunity Y. They just want to understand how you think and that you've done your homework and that you can espouse that. And then the third is really your character, your values, and your attitude. Who are we getting, right? I feel very strongly about something that has been controversial on my team, which is that I won't hire someone if they do not send a thank you note. And the reason that I believe that is there's a certain convention about how you're supposed to behave when you're going through an interview to put your best foot forward. And if I can't trust you to do that in that moment when there's an expectation about how you're supposed to behave, how can I trust you with a customer who's spending millions of dollars with us 6 months later? So the interview never ends, and those signals that you make throughout that are critical around your attitude, your humility, and your character. Those are really the 3, in my view, Natalie. Johnny, what do you think?
No, I think those are great tips. I think in general, I think as you go through an interview process, to Mike's point, I think it's important to answer questions maybe in somewhat of a formulaic way where I think it can take out the stress of the specific example. Again, whatever the question is, zoom out. Philosophically, I believe this. To Mike's point, here are my examples on how I brought that philosophy to life. And then here are the ways that I've thought about deploying that skill set against the job that I'm applying for. So I think there are a number of ways to do that. Mike's bringing up, like, make sure you know what you stand for. I also think in most of these interviews, you're probably going to get one of or multiple of 6, let's call it 6 or 7 questions. And so you can organize your thoughts based on those likely questions that are going to come down around what you believe, the homework you've done, how you've thought about your skill set and how it will apply to this role. So I think there are a number of things you can do, but it goes around to prep and making sure you understand what you stand for and what you believe and why you think you will be the best candidate for the role. But those are all things that I think are overcomable through preparation, and there are a number of ways to do that.
Great. And I love, Mike, I second heartily what you say about thank you notes. Please do not underestimate the power of sending a thank you note, or the power of not sending one. So I do want to make sure that we've got time for some of these audience questions. So I'm going to pivot us to those. John, this one's probably for you, I would imagine, given your role, but we've got somebody asking, what's an example of a Google certification that's like students could use?
Yeah, so AdWords is kind of all the what's generally seen as, or Google Ads. All those certs are free. Teaches you the ins and outs of search or YouTube or display advertising, sometimes known as banner advertising. And all those certs can be done in a matter of days, depending on how fast you want to go through them. But I can tell you, we've had a couple of candidates, entry-level candidates, that have applied for the role. And part of what they did before applying was got themselves certified. And it does a few things. Again, it gives you a language that you don't have to be able to relate to with the interviewer. And it also just demonstrates, again, like, oh, wow, this person took time to get themselves up to speed on our business, our products, and how they work. I'm not going to have to actually get them grounded there. They're going to hit the learning curve a little bit harder. So it does make a difference in terms of making an impression. And then also, if the interview goes well, the hiring manager knows, like, I got a person who's already at least part of the way up the learning curve, and we won't have to give them some of those basics. We won't have to get them certified. So that's a good example of that. There are more sophisticated ones. Grow with Google is an organization within our company that does longer form kind of certs around project management, cybersecurity, UX design, those things, which have some cost them and take longer. But there are some things that you can just get done, over a weekend or over a week, depending on how much time you have, that really will stand out in the process.
Awesome. And then John,
we're not the only, sorry,
no, you're good. You're
company that offers these. A lot of companies do this. And I think there's a bunch of different forms that takes by industry.
Great. And then just sort of as a follow-up to that, we've had a couple of students ask if you can explain more about what you meant when you used the word vernacular. I think it's a vocab term that maybe a few people have not been familiar with.
Yeah. So it just refers to, like, what is the language of the industry, right? What are the buzzwords? What are the acronyms that a lot of these certificates will train you on? And it just gives you a way to relate, again, to the hiring panel and demonstrate, hey, I'm immersed in your business. I took these certs, and therefore it gives me the language to speak with them on their terms.
Great. Mike, Jen wants to know, is it okay to send your thank you email, like to send it through email?
Yes. I think that's generally accepted. I will tell you, I remember by name people who sent me handwritten cards. I also understand that the process can move really fast, and the handwritten card may not get there before the decision is made. So you have to make the best judgment, but in short, email works really well.
Great. And then this one, I don't know if either of you feel like you've got insight into, but I'm going to throw it out there and we will see. We've got somebody wondering what the outlook is for university students, UK university students who want to go to the US for employment. Is it more difficult? Are there advantages? So as you guys are looking to hire, how are you thinking about or prioritizing people who are already inside the domestic US versus in the UK or elsewhere through the world?
The best for Mike, given his international team and background.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's a good one. I think there's a couple different ways to look at it. You do see quite a few international citizens come to the U.S. for graduate school or for school in general on a student visa, and then can translate that into a work visa. They're here in the United States. They've built some really unique skills. They want to stay here. They want to work for employers that may be multinational but based in the United States. So there is that's been an emerging space for quite a number of years. Certainly, there was a lot of complexity with people, the sort of work mobility through COVID, and some of the challenges around that as as getting into the country changed, et cetera. But I think, for example, my team, which is the majority of the team is based in the US, but has people from more than 20 countries and speaks more than 30 languages, have had that experience, meaning they came for education in the United States, or in many instances, they were employed with Google in Europe or another continent and then transferred their role to the US. So I think, to try to make this a little bit more practical, I think you have to have some idea or a vision of where it is you want to work and what those requirements may look like, and why you would be uniquely qualified for that, because you may be competing against locals or American citizens, and there may be certain conditions or policies around who can be hired for those roles. Typically, most firms in more complex hiring environments like ones right now may be less inclined to sponsor visas. It depends on the firm and it depends on what they're looking for, but you will see some of that as well.
Great. Quick question, and then I think we'll ask one final question and get everyone out of here. I want to be respectful of your time, of the participants' time. This has been such a helpful and good conversation. And I look forward to hearing from people who maybe find that first job based on something that they learned today. So please let us know. We love those stories. But what are your thoughts about unpaid internships? Are they worth it? Should students, if they find an opportunity for an unpaid internship, should they go to work for free?
Yeah, I'll try to jump in there. Look, those still exist. I think increasingly, though, most of them are paid. I know that was probably more of a thing when I was getting out of school, but increasingly we're finding them to be paid. I guess it just comes down to this: is what are you pursuing? How passionate are you? What are you willing to sacrifice to get into that? And if there's an unpaid opportunity that fits what you feel like is going to be a difference maker down the road, then I think you need to consider it. Going back to our advice is, try to say yes, because you never know where things are going to go. Hopefully we're paying students for their time and their insight. I think there's a lot that they can contribute on those internships, but I would tell you, if you feel like that the experience you're going to get because of who you're going to work for, the mentor you may get out on the back end of it, unique insights that place may have if they can't afford to pay for the intern, and I think you got to weigh that and just see if you can sacrifice it. Hopefully we're paying most interns these days. I believe that's the case in many different capacities, but like all things, it may be worth the sacrifice if you feel like this is such a unique experience based on where you feel like your core competencies and your passions lie career-wise.
Yeah, I would say enthusiastic +1 to that. And I think there's an opportunity to create those opportunities. For example, if someone really wanted to work with Natalie and be exposed to Natalie's work as the president of a highly regarded firm in the education space, you could ask Natalie, what are you working on right now that someone like me might be able to help you with? And could I offer 5 hours of my time per week to help you with that project? And so the idea there is that you're going to get exposure to someone who's in an executive role, who's clearly worked hard to get there and is overseeing, a massive operation. But you're proactive. I mean, you're sending a message by raising your hand and not just responding to an open role that may be unpaid, but instead, really what I want to do is I want to grow and I want to learn, and this is the person that I want to do it next to. And so I've seen that in some instances too, which I think is really meaningful, and maybe within someone's grasp if they just maybe change the mindset about how to approach it a little bit.
Yeah, I think fun fact, Mike, that is actually how, when I did tech consulting in a previous life after law school, and that was how I got the job, right? Sent my resume through the standard channels, and HR responded right away, said, wow, really interesting resume, but you have no relevant experience, so we don't have anything for you at this time. So I put on a suit, printed out the resume, showed up at the door and said, hey, can we sit down? I'll show you why a lot of this is relevant. And by the way, if you want me to work as an intern to start and prove myself, I'm willing to. And they hired me on the spot and was leading their biggest project within a year. So, this is like, you show up, you ask, you're willing to make connections and willing to sort of do whatever is necessary, right, to start. I want to wrap us up here with one final question. If you guys could roll back time and talk to your 25-year-old self And what advice would you give him?
Mike, why don't you go first?
Oh gosh. Say yes. I think that's the main thing that I would stress. Don't let sort of perfect get in the way of good. I know that's a cliche, but this idea that you have to have this job with this in this space with this company by this age, I think let go of that and focus more on the experiences and the qualities and the muscles and the skills that you're gaining versus sort of the outcome or how it might be perceived, right?
Yeah, I hit on this earlier. Don't be afraid to ask for help, right? And again, that comes in the form of networking. I think most people are really, really flattered by that. It can be intimidating when you're starting your career, but the reality is, um, career veterans have also been in the position you're in, and they know how valuable it can be for somebody to reach a hand out and give advice, give perspective, make another connection. They definitely want to do that. And I would just say, like, do your homework and don't be afraid to get out there and ask for mentorship or ask to network with people. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how often people want to lend a hand.
Well, thank you both for lending a hand today and just for this conversation. We did have one participant already ask and say, hey, can I get contact information so that I can, ask some follow-ups? So for those of you who are here, Mike and John and I'm sure would be happy to talk to people and give you recommendations. So I will for sure send along my contact information when you get the recording and pass along whatever they're willing to share as well. But just really appreciate the time, the advice, the wisdom today. It can be very scary to step out into the unknown, right? For so many of these students, there's been a prescribed path for their whole lives. You know that you're going to go to pre-K, and then you know that you're going to go to kindergarten and elementary and middle and high school, and you know that you're going to go to university. And then all of a sudden, you're at the edge and you're like, well, what now? And so for many people, this is the first time that they realize that like the train has stopped and it's the last station and they're coming off and they're like, well, what the heck? So thank you for providing sort of some starting points and some things that people can do as they're trying to decide, how to craft the life that they want, how to build the career. So.
Yeah, Natalie, feel free to pass along our contact information or feel free to find us on LinkedIn. We're there. I always respond to notes that we get there. So find us in either place. Happy to help.
Great. Thank you all. Bye.
All right.
Thank you.